It's immoral to let a sucker keep his money. Well, that's what the seasoned con artist would say. This cheeky motto might seem like a tongue-in-cheek justification for their crafty heists, but let's face it, sometimes it's hard to muster sympathy for their victims, especially when you hear about the outlandish scams they've fallen for. We've all heard about how some poor soul was taken for a ride by an outlandish con and thought, how could anyone fall for that? From the silver-tongued religious cult leaders who can convince their followers to part with fortunes, to the ambitious street urchins executing a flawless 3-card Monty, the art of the scam is as diverse as it is cunning. And then there are those budding con artists, forever on the lookout for their unsuspecting investor to swindle with their too-good-to-be-true get-rich-quick schemes. But hold on, aren't we smarter these days? In our era of information overload, shouldn't it be harder to pull the wool over our eyes? Unfortunately not. If anything, it makes it easier. We're just as vulnerable to scams today as our ancestors were centuries ago. The allure of a quick win or a life-changing opportunity blinds even the savviest among us. But don't lose hope. There is good news. The psychology behind these scams is timeless. The charismatic grifter, the vulnerable mark, and the promise of turning dreams into reality. These elements remain unchanged. What evolves are the disguises these tricks wear to stay one step ahead. So they might have a facelift, but inside these cons are literally the oldest trick in the book. In fact, some scams are so brilliantly simple, they've barely changed at all. Why fix what ain't broken, right? So whether you want to know the tricks of the trade, or whether you're a con artist seeking inspiration, today's deep dive into the world of cons, scams, swindles, and frauds will unravel the historical threads of deceit. Street crime. Hands down, street crime is the staple of all scams, because it only needs a lone trickster and an unsuspecting sucker. Why pull off an Ocean's 11 heist when you can lift someone's wallet when they're not looking? At the core of street crime is pickpocketing, a craft so ancient it predates pockets. Since humans learned to walk upright, pickpockets have been honing their sleight of hand, but for the most part, their wicked ways were not widely known. Then came along Charles Dickens. His character of Oliver Twist helped the public consciousness understand the criminal underworld in detail. Yet this is no mere literary fancy. Pickpockets are in every country, every culture, and every time. But when it comes to one of the most well-known, we have to turn to Mary Frith. Born in 1584, she carved her legend in 16th century London, not just with her deft fingers, but with a bold fashion statement: cross-dressing. She wasn't just defying the law, she was thumbing her nose at societal norms by smoking a pipe and strutting in men's attire. But she wasn't challenging gender roles because of an identity crisis. It was simply a way to stick it to the man, similar to why punks have green mohawks and nose piercings. Usually, standing out from the crowd isn't a good thing for a pickpocket, but Mary's skills were famous. Her signature move is how we got the word cut purse, because she would, you guessed it, cut the strings of a purse before making a quick getaway. Her antics were so legendary that plays were written about her during her lifetime. She would even star on stage by dressing as a man. Apparently, that was a bigger social faux pas in 17th century England than theft. But you don't have to be bold like Mary to be an effective pickpocket. Sometimes the pickpocket works solo. They stick close to a mark and finger any light objects. Other times, there's a team, one to distract, the other to extract. It's an art form so effective, so timeless, not even the CCTV or beat cops can stop them. So it's time to learn how history works as we pull back the curtain on history scams. Street cons and hustles. The next step up is the street con. Think of this like the Pokemon evolution of street crime. They require more showmanship, planning, and subtler manipulation. These are all about deception in plain sight. Take the classic 3-card Monty, a true masterpiece of street deception. Here, the dealer, and by that I mean the con artist, puts down cards and shuffles them for a game of Find the Lady. However, a planted accomplice, the shill, plays along, engineering a loss so close to victory that you're lured into a false sense of triumph. But remember, in this game, the only winning move is not to play. There is no chance of winning. I repeat, there is no chance of winning. It's a sleight of hand whereby the dealer hides cards beneath one another. This ironclad con first emerged in the 15th century, though the most well-known operator was Canada Bill Jones. He was a 19th century maestro of the Monty. He was such a good crook that newspapers lauded him as the greatest of confidence men. Unfortunately for him, his success as a riverboat gambler couldn't prevent him from dying a pauper. It goes to show, crime doesn't pay. Then there's the shell game, the 3-card Monty's crafty cousin. tracing its roots to ancient Greece and gaining notoriety in the painting of the European Middle Ages until bursting into popularity in the 19th century with the advent of circuses and fairs. It's a game of finding a ball hidden under one of 3 cups. To the sucker, it appears as if the dealer is just moving the cups around at lightning speed. In reality, the ball is discreetly removed right under the mark's nose. These street cons prove that the most straightforward illusions have a timeless allure. But for criminals eager to hit the jackpot, they'd need to get more creative. Counterfeiting. Is it any surprise that you'll find the roots of counterfeiting stretch all the way back to the creation of coinage? The craft of faking money is as old as money itself. In ancient Rome, cunning crooks mastered the art of shaving precious metals from coins, and then melting them down to mint their own fortunes. Some even took to crafting coins from cheaper metals. Of course, they had to coat them in a thin veneer of gold or silver to complete the illusion. In those days, they didn't have today's advanced systems for detecting fake cash, so defrauding an individual was as easy as destabilizing an economy. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, and you'll find blacksmiths doing the trick of melting down metals to forge money. But as the art of minting grew more sophisticated, the forger's task became increasingly challenging. Nowadays, banknotes contain all kinds of fail-safes like the weight of the paper, hidden ink, and images that only appear when held up to light. Yet, counterfeiters weren't deterred. They simply shifted gears. Why fake money when you could fake things that were more valuable? By the 9th century, bishops, hungry for power, began crafting fake decrees which they alleged were written by earlier popes. These decrees granted them new powers and rights, which means it was the papal equivalent of faking your parents' signature on your report card. Fast forward to 14th century Hungary, and we meet Archdeacon Georgi Hondo, a master forger whose false documents and seals were so convincing that they swayed political decisions and territorial claims. Then came the era of art forgery, and with it, Han van Meegeren, a Dutch painter who duplicated masterpieces in the 20th century. He had a particular penchant for Johannes Vermeer's work. His pièce de résistance, The Supper at Emmaus, it was so brilliantly forged it duped art experts and Nazis alike, including Hermann Göring. Telling the difference between a work of art and its fake requires a delicate balance of art history, a keen eye, and meticulous scientific analysis to determine whether materials and pigments used are from modern times or bygone eras. But Van Meegeren was simply filling a void left by demand, a demand that surged during the Renaissance as classical art and artifacts became all the rage. Enterprising forgers of the time didn't stop at canvases. They turned to the arduous task of sculpting entire statues to sell off as ancient treasures. Counterfeiting from metal to marble, from paper to paint, is a testament to the lengths some will go for the perfect swindle. But all these are nothing compared to the other long cons. Real estate. It's been said that real estate is the best, quickest, safest, and the only way to get wealthy. And it certainly is for scammers. Faking deeds and property rights is one of history's oldest forms of fraudulence, but it's not just quaint farmhouses and new city developments that are bought and sought. Enter Victor Lustig, a maestro of deceit in the roaring 1920s who sold the Eiffel Tower. The renowned Austrian-Hungarian scammer dressed up as a government official and promised scrap metal dealers that the Eiffel Tower was due to be torn down. After all, the Eiffel Tower was originally planned as a temporary attraction for the World Fair. Plus, there were recent newspaper articles about the landmark's maintenance costs and public approval ratings. This air of legitimacy was so vital in helping him pull off the con so well that he sold the Eiffel Tower twice. Meanwhile, over in the US, George C. Parker was making a career by selling New York's landmarks. His portfolio included the Brooklyn Bridge, Madison Square Garden, and the Statue of Liberty. But his targets were not desperate businessmen. He preyed upon the naivety of trusting immigrants. His ruse was uncovered when police caught his victims erecting tool booths along the Brooklyn Bridge. Though Parker's escapades included a daring courthouse escape and a sheriff's uniform, his luck eventually ran out. His fourth conviction would be his last, and he spent his final days locked up behind the bars of Sing Sing prison. But the crown jewel of property cons belongs to Scottish charlatan Gregor MacGregor, who sold a country that didn't exist. In the 1820s, he approached European investors with his fake Central American country of Poyes, complete with a fake currency and fake history. In the end, 250 people immigrated across the world only to discover that their new home country wasn't real. Speaking of things that aren't real, spiritualism and religion. Spiritual deception is as old as the Oracle of Delphi in ancient Greece. Here, the Pythia would deliver cryptic prophecies, especially to wealthy patrons who would pay to hear good things. The ancient practice of BS has evolved into the modern theatrics of cold reading, where today's mediums of psychics feign divine insight. It's a simple yet effective combination of high-probability guesses and body language analysis to guide a conversation. Check out any modern-day medium, and you'll see them employing a technique known as cold reading. But these spiritual deceptions aren't confined to dimly lit rooms with crystal balls. They've found their ways into the realms of entrepreneurship with religious fervor. Pyramid schemes, for instance, use similar manipulative tactics, preying on fears and aspirations around wealth and freedom. Thankfully, not every phony psychic escapes the law. American televangelist Jim Bakker built himself an empire of fame and fortune off the backs of credulous, desperate folk. He used their money to create a Christmas theme park, but when it came to light that he was embezzling their investment, the jig was up. He even used $250,000 to pay off a secretary who had accused him of rape. It couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. In the end, he went down for 24 counts of wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy, though he only served 5 years for his 45-year prison sentence. However, his short stint did him good. He emerged from prison a changed man who believed in the impending apocalypse, and just so happened to have doomsday kits to sell. One scammer who did feel the pain of guilt was Marjo Gortner, a child preacher prodigy turned whistleblower. As a 4-year-old, his parents groomed him into becoming the youngest ever ordained minister. During the 1972 Oscar-winning documentary Marjo, he revealed the tricks of the preacher trade, such as stagecraft, rhetorical devices, and how to count wads of cash in a seedy hotel room. Though no doubt one of the reasons for his disillusionment with the exploitive preacher circuit was when his dad absconded with millions of dollars. He did turn his life around though. He stopped pretending, and he became an actor. But perhaps the most well-known spiritual scammer was Rasputin. The mysterious Russian mystic entered the royal courts with his alleged healing abilities and prophetic powers, and, of course, his prowess in the bedroom. However, historians now regard him as nothing more than a randy charlatan who manipulated those around him for his own personal gain. Go figure. But what all these stories show is that dreams, fears, and anxieties of humans never change, which is exactly why this next con attracts so many suckers. Investment schemes. Thomas Tusser first said, "A fool and his money are soon parted," way back in 1557. If he'd been around when the stock market was invented, he might have said, "A fool and another person's money are soon parted." That's because the labyrinthian design of investment scams is intricately designed to bamboozle amateurs and distract professionals. Take, for instance, Pharaoh Psamtik I of ancient Egypt, who was outwitted by his own mercenaries in recorded history's earliest finance cons. He had hired a group of Greek mercenaries to serve in his army, but once their services had concluded, he did not pay them. So the mercenaries came up with a scheme to get their payback. Literally. Their plan? A fake ransom. The leader of the mercenaries, Phanes, left his own children in Egypt as supposed guarantee of his return, but instead he fled to Libya, where he advised the king to send a large sum of money back to Egypt. But instead of the pharaoh getting a payday, the mercenaries intercepted the gold, took the children, and got out of town, leaving the ruler without money or soldiers. If that's confused you, that's fine. Financial scams are designed to feel either too easy or too hard to understand, which means you are either lulled into a false sense of security or defer to the con artist to do the math for you. That's why Charles Ponzi's scheme became so famous. During the roaring 1920s, Ponzi audaciously promised investors outrageously high returns on their investments in international reply coupons. The catch? He used one group of investment money to pay off returns to another group of investors. In essence, he was passing dollar bills down the line to make them believe he was generating wealth. As expected, the house of cards eventually collapsed under its own weight, but he almost got away with it. When a Boston financial writer suggested that Charles Ponzi was up to no good, the con artist sued him for libel, and won. Ponzi was awarded $500,000 in damages, which would be around 10 million big ones today. Still, that's a drop in the ocean compared to Bernie Madoff, who pulled off the largest Ponzi scheme in the history of the world. He defrauded a staggering $65 billion from his clients, who included Steven Spielberg, Larry King, and Kevin Bacon. His crimes came to an end when clients wanted to pull their money out during the 2008 financial crisis. But it was his own sons who called the cops when he confessed to them that his business was, quote, a giant Ponzi scheme. Then there was Enron, the behemoth of the energy world, whose scandal rocked corporate America. Through a web of complex accounting charades, Enron's top brass masked debt and inflated the company's value to astronomical heights. Thankfully, skeptical analysts and investigative reporters exposed discrepancies in the company's finance reports. When the truth surfaced, the bubble burst. Investors pulled out, resulting in a rapid share price drop that caused the company to collapse. The result was the largest bankruptcy due to fraud of all time. As for the culprits, They got between 5 and 12 years in jail, but their victims had already lost hundreds of millions in retirement funds and lifetime savings. That brings us neatly to our final scam. It's the newest one in human history, but something tells us it's going to be around for a long time. Bitcoin. Whatever you think of blockchain technology or cryptocurrency, you must admit, it's a gold rush for scammers. Fortunes are made and lost in the blink of an eye. Picture Jimmy Zhong, a modern-day digital bandit who managed to abscond with a staggering $3 billion in Bitcoin. Then there's the enigmatic social media rapper Razzlecon and her hacker husband masterminding a $4.5 billion crypto laundering saga like an internet version of Bonnie and Clyde. And then there's the lucrative pump and dump schemes pulled off by Logan Paul and Brian King Legend. That's not his real name, of course. Typically, these cons work by acquiring large amounts of new coin quietly and secretly. The second phase is creating buzz by spreading rumors and that the coin is the next big thing. As the frenzy mounts, so does the price. Amateur investors, lured by the promise of a quick buck, pile in. As soon as the price has been driven up sufficiently, the original puppet masters sell their holdings at an inflated price, grab their cash, and skedaddle. Their promotion grinds to a halt. The artificial demand evaporates, and the inflated crypto bubble bursts, leaving a trail of financial ruin in its wake. But the most dramatic fall from grace belongs to Sam Bankman-Fried, once the golden boy of the crypto world who was vocal about transparency and regulation in the Bitcoin space. That came to bite him in the butt because he was found guilty of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. His towering fortune of $15 to $25 billion came tumbling down. He's now worth a grand total of zero, and is now facing up to decades behind bars. But at least he'll have the time to think about how things could have been different if he just did the Nigerian prince scam. But who is more guilty? The con artists or the people who are easily duped? Capitalism is as American as apple pie. A simple internet search of Americana will reveal that corporate brands are ubiquitous throughout the landscape of the United States. But the biggest companies aren't necessarily the ones with theme parks with fluffy mascots. There are plenty of huge businesses that hide behind subsidiaries. In the case of Amway, part of their longevity has been down to having friends in very high places. Very high places. Even George Bush Jr. gave the eulogy at the funeral of one of the founders. Longevity is also helped by having a couple hundred or so billion in the bank too, especially when they have to fork out tens of millions of dollars to settle out of court every time the FTC does another investigation into pyramid scheme practices. For many, Amway is a cult-like scam whose operators should be in jail. For others, it's an innovative business structure who has a right to keep their cards close to their chest. Is this a case of haters gonna hate or scammers gonna scam? Both of these opinions seem appropriate for a company whose name is short for American Way.
Understood everything. I saw that it was pretty simple.
And with an Amway business, you can start creating revenue day one. I mean, that's pretty awesome.
So it's time to learn how history works as we unravel the corporate history of Amway. First things first, what is Amway and how the hell do they make their money? It was founded on November 9th, 1959, by school friends Richard DeVos and J. Van Andel, although some sources say they met in the Air Force. Together, they started many business ventures, including a hamburger stand and a sailing business, but eventually they got the idea for their own direct sales company when they experienced the business model firsthand. Way back in 1949, shortly after serving in World War II, the duo were introduced to the Nutrilite Products Corporation, where individuals purchase supplies to sell door to door, like being an Avon lady, except instead of lipstick and hairspray, it's powdered soup and snake oil. The idea is the supplier saves money on competing for space on store shelves and billboard placement, where the sales rep doesn't deal with any middlemen of their own. You can already see the initial appeal. Who doesn't want to be in charge of their own working hours? Yet, it only took 2 weeks for Richard and Jay to lose interest. That should have been the end, but they were nagged by a mutual friend to give the venture another shot, so they did. They attended seminars and talks by company representatives. They watched newsreels made by the Nutrilite company and heard testimony of successful distributors. Now, they were inspired. In fact, they were so inspired that they turned their furniture importing company into a dedicated Nutrilite distribution center. Within 10 years, they had recruited 5,000 or so distributors of their own. However, they soon broke away to create Amway to focus on beauty, health, and home care products. At the time, Nutrilite was involved in a dispute with the FDA over false advertising claims. Shipments were seized by authorities where a booklet was discovered claiming that the products cured diseases that they simply did not cure. In response, the distributor brought a suit against the government body, claiming that the confiscation was unconstitutional, but the US Supreme Court ruled in the FDA's favor. Nonetheless, the lawsuit made Richard and Jay fear for their job security, which is why they set up their own company in 1959, later renamed to Amway in 1963. Then, in 1972, they bought most of Nutrilite before owning it all in 1994. That's quite a story of the American dream. So what's the catch? As you might expect, the details are in the fine print. Amway would pitch themselves as a direct selling company or networking marketing company, which is a jazzy way of saying multi-level marketing. Now, that's not exactly the same thing as a pyramid scheme. Check out our video on how money works to understand the difference. But for most people, it's close enough. After all, members are incentivized to recruit new people into the business, and of course, you must pay to become a member. People certainly are the main revenue stream of the company. The Amway website pitches them as empowering people to live their best. That's a pretty selfless and noble mission for a company that turned over $8.8 billion in 2018. So how did DeVos and Van Andel scale their business from boxes of nutritional supplements in their garage to a global household name? Strap in, because this is where it gets dark. A quick search on the internet will bring up a lot of negative press about Amway. You won't struggle to find testimonials from ex-members ranting about the company's sinister recruiting practices. A common theme from recruiters bears a striking similarity to how cults recruit followers. Love bombing, including excessive compliments about a target's personality and intelligence, presenting mentors as having solutions to your problems, and answering questions with a question. That's how Amway workers are trained. This means it's hard to get a straight answer about anything. In fact, workers are trained not to mention Amway, as if the first rule of Amway is do not talk about Amway. You'll notice this if an old school friend asks you to dress up nicely and meet them at a mediocre apartment. You'll be told it's a party, but in fact, it's a motivational seminar where the name is only revealed at the very end of the captivating show. It's such an effective recruitment tool that newer MLMs use it, including Venmo. Well, before it was shut down for being a pyramid scheme. These techniques are designed to disarm new members into a state of safe ambivalence, but the indoctrination doesn't stop there. Members are told that they can boost their earnings by attending seminars, reading books, and even going on dedicated cruises for how to sell Amway. The best part is they are available at discounted prices. Of course, the discount had to be bought by becoming a member, and if you're still paying to pursue these life-affirming activities, what's the problem with taking a hit now? You're gonna make it big, right? Not exactly. The number of resources that Amway members are encouraged to research, and we mean encouraged in the Tony Soprano sense, never seems to end. The good news is the internal reward system means that purchasing these products boosts your seller level, like an achievement on Xbox. Except instead of unlocking a bonus for making money, you get patted on the back for remortgaging your house. As you might expect, the internal reward system is nothing more than gold stars on a school chart. Empty, meaningless titles that give the lucky ones access to, wait for it, early bird tickets to more seminars and lectures and conventions. And that's assuming you can even understand the convoluted grading system. In essence, the company grew the same way a donkey is led by a carrot on a stick. A lot of the strange recruitment practices are covered in the book Amway, The Cult of Free Enterprise, which was written by a former distributor called Stephen Butterfield. The blurb says Amway is an authoritarian movement in the middle class that has an alliance with the religious right. According to Donna, in her 5-star Amazon review, my jaw dropped each time I read verbatim the lines and phrases I'd heard come from our former upline's mouth. My husband was recruited into Amway by his friend just under a year ago, and by the time, myself and another actually had to have an intervention to show him how much money we were spending on the business. He'd almost lost $30,000. He made his final decision to get out of Amway when he heard that his friend who'd recruited him had lost almost $200,000, been evicted, and lost all the family's possessions, and is now destitute. By now, you're probably asking yourself, if this thing is so iffy and people are getting ripped off, how is it still around? Good question. And the answer to that is power. Amway has its fingers in many pies. In fact, it's got so many fingers in so many pies that drawing it out might make it look like a triangle hierarchy, which is a 2D pyramid. Take its hotel. That's right, it owns a hotel. In 1981, the Pantland Hotel reopened as the Amway Grand Plaza Hotel in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Though the hotel is technically owned by AHC Plus Hospitality, formerly known as Amway Hospitality Corporation, which is technically owned by Alticor, which is technically owned by Amway. For reference, Amway's HQ is based in Otta Township, which is only 10 miles away. Alticor is run by both the DeVos and Van Andel families, and acts as a parent company to Amway, Amway Global, as well as the manufacturing and distribution companies that are used by Amway and its entities. If this is starting to sound confusing, that's kind of the point. The Inception-style approach to businesses within businesses helps to keep things covert. It's hard to know where Amway starts and ends, which makes it harder for regulators and authorities to investigate allegations of white-collar crime. And those are just some of Amway's assets. The company and the two families at the top also have owners of sports teams like the NBA's Orlando Magic, as well as the indoor arena where the teams train, aka Amway Center. You might have seen it in some notable WWE Royal Rumbles or in front of the countless musicians who have played there, including Paul McCartney, Elton John, Taylor Swift, Lady Gaga, and of course, Nickelback. Real estate isn't the only thing Amway is interested in, though it is one of the few areas where they are happy to have their name known. They also directly and indirectly fund social programs, especially within the fundamentalist religious angles. The DeVos' Family Foundation has given millions to groups like the Family Research Center, an evangelical activist and think tank whose rhetoric around gay marriage was widely seen as homophobic. In 2020, the FRC was approved of the status change by the IRS as it claims to be an association of churches. This means that they operate as a nonprofit organization whose religious status shields it from public inspection, and is no longer required to submit public financial information. This means we can't know exactly how Amway's money is used to influence the government, but we have a good reason to be suspicious when we reveal how the family is structured. Richard DeVos would father 4 children. One is Richard. He grew up in the family business and tried to enter politics when he ran an unsuccessful bid to become governor of Michigan. His wife would fare better in Washington. Betsy DeVos was picked to be the United States Secretary of Education by then-President Donald Trump, whose election campaign had received huge support from the Amway families. In fact, Trump's last rally in his bid to beat Hillary Clinton was held at the DeVos Place Convention Center. Betsy is familiar with billionaires, having been a daughter of manufacturing tycoon Edgar Prince. His business ownership made him one of the wealthiest men in Michigan during his lifetime. But he was also interested in faith, which is how he would come to co-found, you guessed it, the Family Research Council. He also had a son, Eric. He is a businessman too. The former U.S. Navy SEAL officer was the founder of the private military company Blackwater.
Some people will always hate the name Blackwater. They might not like me. I am perfectly comfortable with that.
He gave that up, though, to start a private equity firm in Hong Kong. You can make your own speculation about what exactly he is getting up to over there. What we can say is that Blackwater Worldwide was contracted by the United States in 2003 during the Second Gulf War. However, the new Iraqi government that emerged following the removal of Saddam would revoke Blackwater's license in 2007 when Blackwater contractors were convicted of killing 17 Iraqi civilians during the Nasr Square massacre.
A verdict this morning in a shooting that inflamed worldwide anger over the war in Iraq. Blackwater security guards shot more than 30 unarmed Iraqis in Baghdad in 2007. More than a dozen of them died.
Though Trump would eventually pardon them.
Survivors and relatives of victims of this massacre, and that is the way it is absolutely remembered in Baghdad, as a massacre, expressed outrage that President Trump would pardon these 4 former Blackwater guards.
So much for empowering people to live their best. That explains why George W. Bush cameoed at the funeral for one of the Amway founders. It also explains how the resources and connections in real estate, entertainment, charity, politics, and military, both nationally and internationally, shield them from scrutiny. Anytime the FTC comes knocking, they just need to pick up the phone and hit speed dial to be connected to a guy who knows a guy. After all, what's a fine for running a pyramid scheme when you can elect a president to personally pardon convicted murderers in your employment? Okay, that's stretching it a bit. Amway didn't own Blackwater. At least we don't think it did. Though we wouldn't be surprised if someone from the company that bought the military contractor is on the board of at least one of Amway's subsidiaries. What isn't in doubt is that they are a force to be reckoned with. They have soldiers on the ground, lobbyists in Congress, politicians in their friend groups, religious leaders at their dinner parties, and bankrolls overseas. That's not a bad outcome for 2 guys who got their start shifting boxes of weight loss bars in their rented apartment. Rome wasn't built in a day. But that's all it took for the civilization to fall when the last Roman emperor was deposed. And companies have it even harder, with only a select few lasting a century or so. According to Forbes, of the businesses that made the Fortune 500 list way back in 1955, only 12 were still around by the year 2014. That's an 88% drop, the corporate equivalent of an apex predator going extinct in a single generation. In your own lifetime, you've no doubt seen one-time behemoths of business go bust, broke, or get bought out. But even the sloth dodged a few asteroids, ice ages, and volcanic interruptions. That's why a few business lineages beat the odds without ever needing to become giants. The oldest company in the world is Kongo Gumi, a construction company from Japan who got their start building shrines and temples way back in the year 578. This company's start was as close to Jesus as you are now to William Shakespeare. However, even that is disputed because it had to be saved from liquidation by another company, not because it was a money-making machine, but because of its cultural significance. After all, is it the same company if the name is the same, but the structure is different? What if it changes industries, but not the logo? It's like the old joke of the street broom that never retires because it keeps getting a new brush and handle. But today, we're not going to get bogged down in the philosophical weeds. Instead, we're going to focus on the main survival strategies that help a business to do one thing it's not supposed to do: survive. So it's time to learn how history works as we explain how to make a business that will last 1,000 years. Evolve or die. This advice might sound like a case of the bleeding obvious, but the corporate graveyard is filled with ghosts of CEOs who refuse to get with the times. MySpace was knocked off the top spot by Facebook because it focused too heavily on music. Microsoft was too scared to branch out into music players, which was how longtime rival Apple overtook in sales, recognition, and reputation. And let's not forget that Blockbuster committed financial suicide by refusing to go into streaming when Netflix was a startup looking for a buyer. So when it comes to the best example of how to know when to change things up, look no further than Nintendo. They may be known as one of the most formidable video game giants of modern times, with billions upon billions in the bank. Yet this company is older than video games, having got its start making playing cards back in 1889. At the time, Japan had removed the laws prohibiting Hanafuda playing cards, so Fushijiro Yamushi set up a company to capitalize on this emerging market. Soon, Nintendo was licensing third parties like Disney, but when the new CEO of the booming Japanese company saw the size of the warehouse owned by America's biggest trading card company, he was crestfallen by how limited his company could grow. Nintendo's attempts to pivot into more lucrative industries included taxi firms and love hotels, but it was only when a worker designed a toy claw in his spare time did the company focus on toy manufacturing. The success showed that Nintendo was closer to their specialism, but they still needed that one toy to become their niche. Lo and behold, video game arcades arrived. Let's not forget that these things are still technically toys, which was the reason Nintendo decided to give these things a shot. Again, things were going well, but not well enough. All they needed was to figure out what made their video games different to everyone else's. Then came along a young intern who designed Donkey Kong, and finally the company became a giant conglomerate in the world of consumer electronics. And it wouldn't have happened if they weren't prepared to experiment, pivot, and change the industry. But there might be times when it's better to find a stable market. Find a timeless product. Funeral parlors only need to worry about going out of business when someone cures death, so finding a market based around necessities gives you a stronger chance of making it through hard times. These are known in economics as necessity goods, which means they are goods and services consumers buy regardless of income levels. Think haircuts and food, plus the water, gas, and electricity for homes. It also includes addictive habits like tobacco and alcohol, as well as critical medicine such as insulin, plus hospital equipment like bandages, gauze, and face masks. In short, the common things everyone needs and buys all the time, but don't cost that much to the individual. At the end of the day, everything you use is made by a company, no matter how incidental. It's like that scene in Cocktail where Tom Cruise explains how even paper cocktail umbrellas are making someone $1 million. A look at the oldest companies in the world reveals their sectors include construction, hotels, food, drink, and paper. However, it's much harder to get rich on babysitting and toothpaste than it is on Bitcoin and social media. Then again, the tortoise beat the hare, so it depends on your priorities. The less glamorous your business, the more you can weather the storm over the next 1,000 years, no matter how many revolutions, invasions, and natural disasters come your way. Coke may be a worldwide phenomenon, but what it spends on advertising and marketing is almost what it makes in profit. It's hard to imagine a world without soda, but will their bubble burst eventually? Besides, this is only a means to an end. Once you've got enough cash, you can do the next step. Expand and multiply. It would be nice if your income all came from your work, but examining the biggest companies in the modern world reveals how businesses prop up their main enterprise with a series of revenue streams. Take Apple. Do they sell MacBooks to fund the development of iPhones, or do they sell iPhones to fund the development of MacBooks? What makes more money? Their cut on the App Store, or the sales of AirPods? They all exist within an electronics ecosystem with shared knowledge, but they are distinctly different as a plane is from a car, even when it's made by BMW. That's why the real trick is finding a subsidiary that is more profitable than your main area. And for that, we need to look at the business genius of George Lucas. This man did more to change the structure of the film industry than Walt Disney and Charlie Chaplin combined. Lucas has never shied from criticizing the studios, which is how he knew that he needed to find a way to beat them at their own game. So when they agreed to let him make Star Wars, he had an idea. Offer them a reduced fee for writing and directing in return for 100% of the merchandising rights. Let me say that again. George Lucas got 100% of Star Wars merchandising rights. How did he swing that? Because he figured out that franchises were the next step for tentpole releases. He saw that the real money was in the distribution window with toys, lunchboxes, t-shirts, and then, when the technology developed, video games. Collectively, more money has been made from Star Wars merchandise than the films. In fact, the initial line of toys from A New Hope made Lucas so filthy rich that he was able to fund the remaining movies himself. So, although other studios helped release them in theaters, every film after the first Star Wars installment was technically an independent movie, which is what Lucas wanted.
Yeah, definitely.
Even though he was a better businessman when it came to toys than movies, he's in it for the motion pictures. And that's why Star Wars is going to last 1,000 years, even when new owners Disney finally kicked the bucket. Unless, of course, you don't care about becoming a cultural icon, in which case you might prefer this next strategy: consume and conquer. When the two brothers from Warner finally decided to get into the motion picture industry, they had no way of predicting that their company name would one day be AOL Time Warner. That name is ridiculous. Could you tell me what the company does from looking at it? Thankfully, it became the simpler Warner Media in 2018, though time will tell if and when the name changes again. But the point is that the name became so convoluted because the business uses mergers and buyouts to stay in the game. Its first major shakeup was at the start of the 90s when it merged with the owners of Time magazine. No doubt you've heard of it. But I know some of my audience haven't heard of AOL, which was a company that mailed you free internet on a CD. Yes, you heard that right. That might sound crazy to you, but for people of a certain generation, AOL was their very first portal to the internet. Heck, it was connecting people before Google existed. Even so, the merger between Time Warner Inc. and AOL was controversial at the time because it came at the height of the internet bubble. Some said AOL was overpriced, and others said it was about to become obsolete. It would be like buying MySpace a month before Facebook debuts. But this is key to Warner Media's survival, because a sure way to avoid getting eaten by a predator is to get to the top of the food chain at any cost necessary. To date, the Warner Company has merged, bought out, and spun off so many companies that it's like a Frankenstein's monster of a corporation. Each new acquisition is cut up and stuck on to the point that the company would be completely unrecognizable in structure and service if it wasn't for their legacy name or their repeated attempts to revive Bugs Bunny. The downside to this approach is that executives and departments come and go faster than the company changes letterheads, but the benefit is the ability to stay afloat during some of the most difficult decades of the economy. Most companies are too precious about their identity and product to risk such radical shakeups, which is why they go bust during a recession, market crash, or pandemic. But not Warner Media. So if your objective is to stay in the game for as long as possible, take a page out of their book by making your business about business. However, there is one final strategy that doesn't involve going public or staying private. Join the government. Time will tell exactly how successful this will be, but judging from the success of Chiquita Bananas, it doesn't hurt to become bedfellows with the state. You see, Chiquita is the successor of the United Fruit Company, whose trade of tropical fruit at the turn of the 20th century saw them jockey their immense capital for power and influence. By the mid-20th century, the company was flourishing and controlling vast territories and transportation networks across Central America, Colombia, and the West Indies. Granted, it was competing with the Standard Fruit Company, who later became Dole, but it had maintained a virtual monopoly thanks to its interest from the United States of America. In fact, the relationship was so strong that the company was able to get America's help to quell strikes, overturn elections, and deal with rivals. The relationship between capitalism, tropical fruit, and corrupt government was so strong that the phrase Banana Republic was coined. And no, I don't mean the clothes shop. Anyway, in time, the company would suffer some financial difficulties and be reborn, though there's no doubt that its survival was helped by becoming a subsidiary of politics. Or was it politics that became a subsidiary of the company? The point is, getting the state to be your biggest shareholder is the best insurance a company can have, because it means your survival is tied to the life of a nation and not the volatility of the market. Think back to the banking crisis of 2008. Many countries bailed out the banks, including the UK government, who rescued NatWest. Good thing for the bankers. Their firm was on the brink of collapse. So if you're determined to make your company last longer than you, consider merging with a civilization. The future of work is about to change, at least for some people. Over the last few decades, the 9-to-5 has been ridiculed for its dehumanizing aspects thanks to the iconography of cubicles, employee of the month portraits, and office life. The image is better nowadays, even with open-plan offices and free foosball tables. That's why for some, the 40-hour work week is a false reality, manufactured by exploitative industries who base their reasoning on a society which no longer exists. For others, it's a sign of stability and prosperity, which we should be thankful for now that technology has become a great equalizer. But whether you think the gig economy will usher in financial utopia or economic catastrophe, there's one thing we can agree on. The 9-to-5 is a culmination of humankind's fusion with politics, economics, and labor. If you don't know where it came from, you won't know where the labor market is going. So it's time to learn how history works as we evaluate the evolution of the 9-to-5. From dawn till dusk. Serfdom continued until the medieval period, when a shakeup of society paved the way for a degree of worker autonomy. The first job that provided more freedom was with that of a farmer. Whether or not you were willing to toil in a lord's field or had your own farm, your shift started at the crack of dawn and ended with the setting sun. The hours might have been long, but at least it was nature in charge of the clock and not the crack of a slave master's whip. However, whereas the Egyptian slaves would be working all year round, a medieval farmer would have off-seasons depending on what crops would be planted or harvested. Spring was the time for plowing fields and sowing seeds. Summer was growing crops, as well as farm maintenance and raising livestock. Autumn was harvest. That meant all hands on deck, which likely included any young people to help bring in the yields. As for winter, that was when you planned for the next year and repaired your tools in anticipation. Depending on the size of the farm, females might be devoted to preparing food and housekeeping, while males focused on growing produce to store or sell. Yet, despite the harsh conditions, you would have time for leisure. This marked the first real time that workers had more choice over when not to work. Summers had plenty of days off. Villages had solstices to celebrate, and religious calendars helped navigate yearly attitudes towards work and play over the coming centuries. It may not seem like much to us, but the concept of time having value was huge. Without it, we would not have been able to invent things like an hourly wage. And if running your own farm was too much, you could be a farm hand. Think of these as the basis for freelance work. You could shop around your skills for the best price and strike up a good enough relationship with a client to return to for the next season or year. Maybe you worked in exchange for board and food instead of coin, but you at least could be assessing the value that you bring to the table. Bit by bit, the constraints of work placed on the laborers from the slavery of yore were easing up. Even if agriculture wasn't for you, the emergence of markets and trade meant pathways to alternative work, like crafts. Blacksmithing, fishing, and leatherworking often stayed in families, though it was possible to become an apprentice or change industry altogether. Even bards and chefs could earn their keep. There may not have been any formal regulations or work rights on paper, and the need to fill your belly would always be a driving force. But the slow emergence of a labor market would be needed for the next stage of the evolution of the 9-to-5. Blood and sweat, steam and soot. I don't know if you've heard the news, but the Industrial Revolution was kind of a big deal. The advancements in technology changed the way we viewed labor forever. Machines made previous work easier or obsolete, and the economic boom saw value in labor which produced wants as well as needs. But as plentiful as job opportunities now were, a worker still had to fight tooth and nail to get hired. Contracts didn't exist, and it would be a while before unions gave laborers protections from exploitation. So, instead of waking up at dawn to grow your food, you'd have to get up early to beat the crowd at the factory gates or docks if you wanted to be picked for that day's work. And if you missed out, you'd have to kiss goodbye to a day's wages. You could try another factory, but going solo wasn't easy. Early automation eradicated so much crafts work that only masters in their field could compete with the industrial level output. Not that you complained. If you got on the wrong side of a factory owner, you'd never be hired again, which just meant some other chump would get your spot. Even if you weren't hired, your timetable was out of your hands. The rhythm of a working day was no longer to the melody of Mother Nature, but to the beat of factory machines. This was because everything had to work in sync, including machine maintenance and routine inspections. And with an economic boom, factories had reason to outcompete rivals. This meant society now had a formal workday. Before, shifts were structured around how long a slave needed to rest, or what could be done on a farm. Those restrictions were out of the window. Gone were the seasonal demands or the project requirements. Now it was all about what time frame was the most productive for the factory owners, which, it turned out, was all day, every day. Well, almost. Workdays were a strict 12-hour shift, maybe more. Lunch break? Forget it. You only had the Lord's Day off too, so forget the leisure time that your medieval ancestors were blessed with. A 40-hour workweek was simply not on the cards. Even children joined the workforce. In previous eras, their weaker bodies were a hindrance on building sites or farms. Now, their nimble fingers were perfect for catching debris between the weaving blades of a machine. This alone split up the workforce. This meant you could lose work by simply being the wrong age or height. You can argue these were the emergence of job descriptions. But that's just the good side. At least you were in a city or town with your family. Imagine being a miner. Not only would you be far removed from the rest of civilization, you may have been stuck in a company town. You've probably seen these in old Western movies. In essence, a company would provide its employees with a place to live, as well as access to amenities like stores or a saloon. So far, so good, right? But the catch was that the company owned the other buildings too. The salary you spent in the store went back into your master's hand. Some company towns didn't even pay you a real currency, but their currency, like Mickey Mouse bucks in Disneyland. Of course, you could avoid all this if you were fortunate enough to have a knowledge-based job like a lawyer or a doctor. But the knock-on effect of the Industrial Revolution altering the daily timetable for a country was that even jobs not connected with it had to work around it. Lamplighters got up early to illuminate the roads for commuting workers. Bars and taverns changed opening hours for when factories let out. And as for the ladies at night, let's just say you didn't get as many clients when the factory chimneys were smoking. But at least all this new work created new positions. Factory owners needed managers, who needed sub-managers, and so on. In effect, the corporate ladder was being created. Sure, there weren't many rungs, and most levels were out of reach for the average worker. But once the kinks were ironed out, it'd be impossible to imagine society without a 9-to-5. Clocking in for change. Henry Ford was more than an automobile revolutionary and loony anti-Semite. His attitude towards labor changed society forever, perhaps more than any other person in history. It was his ideas that cemented the 40-hour workweek. But before you get angry and start blaming him, it's worth remembering that this experiment was radical for its time. As the 20th century rolled around, labor rights had progressed a lot. Unions had emerged, contracts were normalized, laws were written to define and defend the rights of every worker, including the creation of a minimum wage. Yet there was still more to be done. It was in this context that the Ford Motor Company in 1914 saw a way to trailblaze labor reform. First, the minimum daily wage of its workers was doubled, and the workday was reduced to around 8 hours. But why? Well, the salary increase improved the standard of living for workers, which in turn saw an improvement in productivity. Ford was all about efficiency, you see. Though he didn't invent the assembly line, he did perfect it. Streamlining the process increased output, which is why the techniques have since been implemented into virtually all other industries, from fast food and coffee to advertising and software engineering. His innovation for a moving assembly line brought the production of a Ford Model T down from over 12 hours to just 90 minutes. Good for him. He had a vested interest in creating a consumer base because he needed people to afford his cars. Of course, the 40-hour workweek was also facilitated by decades of labor movements and union negotiating. For Americans, the Haymarket Affair of 1886 had been pivotal for labor forces. Chicago workers had been striking for an 8-hour day when their violent clash with police caught national attention. But it was Ford who implemented the culmination of these demands in such a way that there was no going back. After decades of campaigning, bosses finally understood why the workers' requests were good for everyone involved. Change was unstoppable. By 1938, the Fair Labor Standard Act was passed in the United States, with similar legislation happening worldwide. These policies established a universal workday, with some countries getting the ball rolling on writing bills to protect paid vacation, sick days, and maternity leave. Oh, and child labor was banned too. Let's not forget about that. But things wouldn't last. By the time the post-war generation came around, the standard 9-to-5 looked to be on its way out. The beginning of the end, right? As consumerism became the new basis for economics and formal education paved the way for high-paying work, the 9-to-5 entered its golden age, for better or worse. For example, it used to be the case that staying late at the office was just a way to get that juicy promotion. Now, it's just expected. Climbing the corporate ladder is no longer about the quality of work you do during your contracted hours, but your willingness to do work for free. What do we call someone who works for free? So what happened? Well, this decline started with the rise of office culture. Rapid expansion in the mid-20th century saw an increased demand for office workers. We're talking administrators, managers, clerks, secretaries, and even temps. Before, the office was reserved for elite board members, but soon every employee was getting their own cubicle, desk, and typewriter. As this way of life spread, its influence became so ingrained in culture that it's just how we do things. All our family time, personal life, and romantic pursuits are scheduled around the 9 to 5, even if we don't have one. And why shouldn't it? The social mobility that comes from it is the type of luxury any medieval farmer would have dreamed of. Well, the first problem about having an economic model as the foundation of our society is it's tied to the market. Multiple recessions and crashes have demonstrated the 9 to 5 is not the guarantee we were all led to believe. Plus, shifts in technology are sparking further debates over the viability of this model, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic. During that time, working from home became the new way, scratch that, the only way to get work done. At the time of writing, we are almost 4 whole years since Zoom call replaced Skype call. For a while, it had seemed this had blown apart the fallacies in the conventional paradigm, like how all employees need meetings to keep them on track. Some sociologists argued the community side of office space was no longer needed in a connected internet world. Even managers were seeing how things could be more efficient by letting employees just do their job. But critics said people were too wedded to the iconography of office life to change things completely. After all, cubicle life has featured in popular media for the last half-century that it's easy to believe that this is how things have always been done. And then there's the emerging gig economy, and ways to make money through the internet like streaming, content creation, and YouTube. Subscribe to How History Works. To some, these advancements in technology are the equivalent of what the Industrial Revolution did to the Agricultural Revolution. It's just evolution, right? They say we're on the cusp of a new labor revolution, where people can work even fewer hours with more rights and more profit. Some European countries have experimented with shortened work weeks, and results seem to be positive. But that came crashing down when the pandemic ended. Bit by bit, companies demanded their workers return to the office. The reason? A drop in profit due to a drop in productivity. It seems the initial boosts of efficiency wore off when employees got used to working in their pajamas. But others say factors like not being able to socialize or leave your house contributed to this. Unfortunately, it seems we might be regressing to a time before the 40-hour workweek. There's already talk of companies in Silicon Valley reviving the company town. Heck, even Mr. Beast has mentioned buying suburbs for his employees. Maybe that's just a pie in the sky, or maybe we're already there. Think of the full-time employees at Amazon fulfillment centers whose paycheck goes towards buying stuff from Amazon, like consumer goods, entertainment services, groceries, and even healthcare. And what about e-banks banning people from their own accounts when they say the wrong thing online? Victorian factory workers didn't have to worry about this kind of ostracism. Let's not forget about artificial intelligence. For so long, physical labor has been the first on the chopping block every time new technology comes around. But now, it seems like knowledge and creative jobs are more at risk from computers than truck drivers and woodworkers.
Money laundering wasn't coined as a term until the 1970s, when the Watergate scandal hit. Since then, the phrase has become a household word, while the crime itself remains a familiar hallmark of criminal enterprises. During the 1990s, the Bank of New York helped Russia launder capital flight when the USSR broke up. HSBC was fined almost $2 billion for cleaning the money of drug traffickers, terrorists, and rogue nations like Iran. Al-Qaeda's financial operations in the run-up to 9/11 couldn't have happened without the help of the United Arab Emirates Dubai Islamic Bank. Allegedly. Even Fortnite isn't safe. After some hackers stole lists of credit card details, they bought in-game currency to sell for real cash. But money laundering isn't relegated to secret boardroom meetings in flashy skyscrapers. Take the US candy shops in London. Over the last 10 years, a suspicious amount of American sweet shops have popped up across the capital, including Oxford Street. As one of the world's busiest streets, the rent here is extremely high. Shops like Topshop, Nike, and Uniqlo have to work hard to cover costs. Yet, similar-looking chains of deserted US candy importers can somehow afford multiple shops throughout the 1.5-mile street. They even operated during the COVID lockdown when other shops struggled to stay open. To nobody's surprise, police raids have uncovered a staggering amount of illegal goods and cash. One derelict shop was fronting up to £55,000 worth of illicit goods, including counterfeit chocolate bars. But where did this all start? How did we get to a world where money laundering is so commonplace that even average citizens treat it like a joke? The origins of cleaning dirty money can be traced as far back as ancient China. Over 2,000 years ago, commercial trading was banned by regional powers, so merchants needed a way to keep their profits from foreign deals during the booming tea trade. According to Sterling Seagrave's book Lords of the Rim, ancient Chinese merchants came up with a few ways to dodge taxation. One was the hawala system, and apologies if I get that pronunciation wrong. It was a semi-certification process where money didn't change hands. In essence, buyers and sellers in different regions would use their local middleman to pass on an IOU. Later, the hawala dealers would resolve the debts between each other by subtracting from outstanding debts or bartering for things of the same value. That way, no formal money exchange took place, so nothing technically entered the economic system. That's why this ancient system isn't money laundering as we define it today, even though it remains a tactic amongst black market businesses and terrorist financiers, although the biggest flaw is that it relies too heavily on trust between partners. It's no wonder that a new, more reliable system had to emerge. That way, criminals could ensure they wouldn't get screwed over by their business partners or undercover agents. So when the biggest businesses on the planet emerged, the conditions were right to jumpstart the creation of money laundering as we know it. So let's start by quickly explaining what money laundering even is. Of course, don't run off and start your own illegal cash flow system. This is for educational purposes only. And besides, if they could jail Al Capone on tax evasion, they sure as heck can get you. Money laundering is making illegally acquired money appear legitimate. So whether you get your dough from smuggling contraband, kidnapping ransom, or robbing a bank vault, you have to clean it before you can spend it. Otherwise, it'll make it easier for the cops to track you down. The first stage is placement. That's when bad cash is introduced into our financial system through a point of entry, like a bank deposit. The next step is layering. That means moving the money around to obscure its origins, like wiring funds between multiple bank accounts in different countries, or investing in a legitimate business as a front. The final step is integration. That's when you take out the cleaned money to spend however you wish. For example, betting your bad cash at a casino and then walking out with a payday of clean bills, or investing in real estate to convert your illegitimate cash into a legitimate asset. Integration is key. That's how criminals get their cash past authorities. Fail at this stage, and it's straight to prison. That's because, despite the complexities behind cleaning cash, spotting a money laundering operation is fairly simple. Just look out for the sudden, unexplainable displays of wealth. The reason every first-time low IQ criminal gets busted is that he is suddenly driving a convertible when just last week he was begging to borrow bus fare. Learning these lessons was the trick needed to launder money during the Age of Discovery. It was these traders who perfected the art of cleaning cash. Without them, the con would never have evolved beyond the humble beginnings of ancient Chinese merchants. So while Britain and Denmark's East India companies were killing each other over trade routes, their merchants were working together to create a nice side hustle. Yet when their bosses found out, business sometimes improved. It turns out that having your employees launder money can be good for your company. It can even be good for your country. The French Revolution was funded in part by money laundering during its broke period, so if it wasn't for some guy in tights figuring out a better way to dodge tax, then we wouldn't have modern Western democracy. So how did the spice trade merchants create money laundering? And were the billion-dollar companies in on the scam or just turning a blind eye? It's time to learn how history works as we uncover history's first money laundering scheme. The Dutch and British East India Companies were nation-sanctioned monopolies set up to give their respective homeland a competitive edge in the emerging spice trade. Technology had improved so much that navigating vast distances was much easier. Hauling back luxury goods from new lands and new allies was a gold rush. Countries pivoted to economics as a path to world dominance, which meant naval merchants were more important than military generals. In fact, these private companies were so large that they had their own military generals. Under the company's unique deals with their countries, the traders could erect forts, go to war, and sign deals with foreign rulers and landowners. It would be like if Amazon signed a deal with the US to become its own nation state where it worked on behalf of the White House. That way, if Amazon's private army had a skirmish with the sovereign state of Alibaba, neither the US nor China would be drawn into a war, even though both corporations were fighting for the explicit interests of their respective governments. With this kind of power, technology, and accountability, the British and Dutch East India Companies were raking in a lot of cash, as were the employees. An office clerk's annual salary would be about $28,000 in today's money. That might not cover all of our modern costs, but at that time, it offered a good life. Moreover, your income and pension rose with every year of employment. By 1840, a company clerk could be taking home about 12 times more than a manual labourer. So long as you were fine copying out documents by hand multiple times and losing sleep from the stress of a simple data error getting you reprimanded, it wasn't a bad gig to have. Yet the company directors had meagre earnings by comparison. Despite helping run a multi-billion-dollar company, salaries could be between $300,000 and $500,000. That's not a bad income for the average person, but a fat cat in a successful Silicon Valley tech company would be making that every week. Not that company directors minded. They preferred it this way. Gifts from people desperate to ingratiate themselves into the money-making machine were just one perk of being a big cheese. So why would you want to get a bigger salary just to pay more tax when you could simply be gifted tax-free money and goods every day? This system of under-the-table transaction was inevitable, given how people needed to be nominated by a director before they could be considered for a job. Getting hired wasn't as straightforward as sending in a resume or having an uncle set you up with an entry position. Even after the board nominated you, they needed proof that they could trust you. Every new hire was expected to put down a good behaviour bond of what would today be worth around $51,000. That's a lot of cash just to stack shelves in the warehouse. And the higher the position, the higher the bond. Back in the 1680s, the president of an overseas factory had to fork up about $360,000 just to have the privilege of earning a salary. But it was money well spent. These corporations were making billions, so it'd all work out once you got a seat at the table. If you couldn't afford the sign-up costs, there were unpaid internships to get your foot in the door. They lasted 5 years. By 1778, internships were only 3 years long, though it wasn't until the start of the 1800s that an intern would get a bit of a salary. But once you were in, it was all free training, free drinks, free food, and even nap rooms like an 18th century version of Google. However, the biggest perk was private trade. Usually it was prohibited given the company's strict orders to run and maintain a monopoly. Yet, employees enjoyed the opportunities to privately trade luxuries far away from the reach of tax collectors. After all, if you had paid so much just to get into the company, it was only fair you supplemented your income with a little private commercial trading, am I right? The thing is, sometimes the company would come down hard on employees doing under-the-table deals. Sometimes people were punished just as a PR stunt. It had to be, given how widespread corruption was. Only rich people could reach the higher ranks of the company. And also, because the company had so much power overseas, that removing a political figure could be devastating. This meant the culture inside the East India trading companies was fine with private trading, so long as you didn't get caught. Imagine that, a multi-billion-dollar financial institution where crime is treated better than negative press. This was why employees didn't petition for a bigger slice of the pie. The real money was in entrepreneurship. Take Robert Clive, British officer, colonial administrator, and, worst of all, politician. He started as a clerk for the British East India Trading Company, then climbed the ranks to eventually help establish British control over India following his decisive victory at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Yet somehow, the guy helping to oversee some of the most profitable trade routes was amassing a personal fortune that was much, much larger than his company salary. We're talking everything from purchasing estates, building mansions, buying himself a seat in government, and splashing out on a luxurious lifestyle for his whole family. He also bought a lot of mirrors for some reason. If you've got an illegal fortune burning a hole in your pocket, you have to spend it on something. Historians estimate that he left India with about £500,000. That kind of cash in the 1750s meant he was one of the richest people in Europe. Depending on which economist you ask, the money he was bringing back was equivalent to between £6 to £8 million, although some estimates suggest it could have been as high as 200 million. It's difficult to know for sure. He was well connected with a lot of loyal men and in charge of a lot of ships, but that's partly why people became suspicious in the first place. 2 parliamentary committees uncovered corruption amongst his servants, which quickly led to exposing Clive as the head of the whole operation. Thankfully for him, his passionate defence in Parliament and respected military victories got him acquitted. Or maybe it was the fact that the courts couldn't decisively prove how he was moving money. Faking invoices was a common practice. But it was clear now to merchants that if a senior member could narrowly avoid trouble, then they'd all need to get much smarter in concealing their ill-gotten gains. They could no longer smuggle gold in the sailors' bedrolls or the false bottoms of trunks. They couldn't depend on bribing a dockhand to let your ship pass through with a cargo hold filled with contraband. It was time to get smart. It was time for money laundering. But not many people knew that a merchant called Thomas Pitt had already elevated money laundering into an art form at the start of the century. His process would remain shrouded in mystery for years to come, but when it was exposed, it was clear that the kinks of money laundering had been worked out. Pitt showed that there was a simpler way to protect your treasure. He was born in Dorset in 1653. By the time he started his career in 1674, the British East India Company had been operating for decades. After a stint in India at their behest, he ignored company orders to return home so that he could stay in Asia to trade privately. When he did land back on British soil, he was promptly fined £400 for interloping. This fine was nothing, though. Pitt had already accumulated a nice fortune and could have retired early if he wanted. So despite promising not to go against the EIC's monopoly, he returned to Asia to trade some more. Over there, silver could get a lot more than back home, so buying up luxury goods was a cinch. He loaded up boats with illegal cargoes of tea, pepper and porcelain. An arrest warrant was issued when he landed back in 1698, but he'd already left for another trading expedition by the time authorities caught up with him. This cat-and-mouse chase came to an abrupt end when the EIC faced fresh competition from emerging companies. In a likely bid to utilise his expertise and cunning, Pitt was hired by the very company trying to arrest him. They knew he was hustling on the side, but decided to overlook this forbidden behaviour because they had bigger fish to fry. When Pitt arrived in Madras, he'd become president of the East India Company, or at least the president of the Madras province. This position made it far easier to continue his private trade, but it also brought in new problems. Pitt had a front row seat to the diamond trade. He figured that if he could clean his money through a diamond purchase, then he'd have a simpler way of transporting his fortune back home. He wouldn't have to worry about the logistics of transporting cargo or paying kickbacks to a network of accomplices. With a streamlined system, there'd be less risk of exposure and an easier way to obfuscate financial transactions. However, diamonds are a risky business. Hard to see blemishes can devalue a stone in an instant, and buyers and sellers are always trying to pull a fast one on each other. But Pitt decided to risk it all. If he could find a good price on one, then he'd be able to smuggle his fortune back easily because the EIC would be concentrating on cargo holds and spices. After years of waiting, he finally caught wind of a special diamond. Legend had it that a slave originally discovered the shiny stone and tried to barter his freedom with it, but the slave master killed him and kept the diamond for himself. Pitt tracked down the stone's current owner and saw it with his own eyes. 410 carats and 85 grams, a beauty. It's not often you can hold generational wealth in the palm of your hands. Despite trepidation from his diamond expert back home, Pitt snapped it up for about £20,400. Adjusting for inflation, that would be around 3.75 million. He hid it in his son's shoe and sent him back to England. Once it was safe, he paid a guy the equivalent of £1 million in modern cash to cut the diamond. When it was ready, he only needed to sell it to the highest bidder, and voila, his vast fortune of dirty money would be clean. Pitt had just created placement and layering. With a buyer, he'd create integration. The problem was Europe was at war, so even the rich elites had to tighten the purse strings. He sat on this diamond for 15 long years. He must have spent that time hoping the EIC wouldn't catch wind of his plan or suddenly decide to arrest him for his previous private trading. Then in 1717, Philippe II, a French regent to Louis XV, bought Pitt's diamond for £135,000. That's a profit of 1,009. Adjusting for inflation, Pitt netted just over £19 million tax-free. It was official. The best strategy wasn't smuggling back gold coins or forging paperwork for trunks of spices. It was converting it into an asset. It was about finding a way to legitimize the money. Now, the diamond is known as the Regent Diamond. It was added to the French crown jewels and owned by the likes of Marie Antoinette. When the French revolutionaries stole it, they used it as collateral for loans. Napoleon did the same thing too when his empire needed a cash injection. Nowadays, the Regent Diamond is on display at the Louvre with an estimated value of $48 million. So even though the likes of the EIC and the VOC are no more, the thing that outlasted their empires wasn't the trade routes maintained by their generals, but the craft of money laundering created by their merchants. Enjoy working from home while you can, because it won't last forever. So, if you think the office job will die before you do, guess again. Just don't hand in your 2 weeks' notice yet. The good news is it's possible that the open office ping pong table hellhole you're stuck working in right now will be replaced with something much more humane. After all, the office evolved over time to give us the model we have now, so it's reasonable to think it will experience another transformation. Startup culture, Wi-Fi, and workers' rights have all helped shape the office up until this point. Surely, the future of the office will be as radical as its past. Most people in history have never worked in an office, so really, this is all a fad. And even if it isn't, 100 years of office tradition isn't going down without a fight. Especially now that work no longer means a physical action. Before, society considered work as something you did that exerted your body, toiling in a field, bricklaying a wall, or smithing battle axes. However, the modern idea of work being something you do with your brain at a computer in an office is so tightly woven into our way of life that it might take a lot more to get humans to rethink the 9 to 5. But even then, that is a double-edged sword. Office jobs might not be so bad when AI and outsourcing replace you. So, how much longer will you be expected to do the morning commutes? What can you expect from the future of workplaces? And have we already missed out on the best employee arrangement? Let's start by being clear about what an office even is. If we can agree that it has something to do with administration, then we can trace the life of the office worker as far back as ancient civilizations. Rome, Greece, Egypt, they all had scribes whose job it was to use their prized reading and writing skill set to help run empires. But they weren't out lounging under palm trees while masons built aqueducts and pyramids. They needed their own place to focus. During the 4th century BC, the Romans created the tablinum, a room for the master of the house to attend administrative duties and for archived documents to be stored. There's evidence to suggest that there'd be a table in the center of the room, which means the first office furniture was a desk and a filing cabinet. Yet these jobs were incredibly rare. Think of them like the Bronze Age equivalent of twirling a sandwich board. It requires a unique skill set to do it, but most people wouldn't be caught dead doing it. By the 7th century, the need for administration had eclipsed the wealthy masters of estates, to include the monks working in a scriptorium. In groups, these men would prepare manuscripts and documents, though it was possible to work in a courtyard or even one's dwellings. That's right, you could work from home. But given monks didn't live far from the scriptorium, often in the same building, it was more like work from the break room. So even with a few more people working in these proto-offices, it was work reserved for the holy. It wasn't for normies. By the time the Renaissance hit, rulers and merchants had so many departments with their own administrative wings that it became easier to house all scribes under one roof. Reading and writing had improved significantly, so the life of a scribe wasn't the specialist rare job it was previously. But it wasn't like they worked a 9 to 5 and had a Christmas bonus. The place of work was just seen as a place where they happened to work. So despite how the appearance of the modern office was forming, the idea wasn't born yet. To go from a room where some stuff gets done to conceptualizing the office radically changed how society values work forever. The society you live in today is run by people in office jobs. And if you're not convinced, consider how normal it is to have a home office, while your place of work appears more home-like. The office job structures your life in so many ways despite being a new thing in the course of human history. How did we get here? Can we turn back? Or is it only a matter of time before the office gets its pink slip? It's time to learn how history works as we examine the rise and fall of the office job. The Old Admiralty in Great Britain is the first building designed specifically to be an office. Running an empire requires a lot of paperwork, so streamlining the operations by having them in one location was a pivotal change in the life of office work. More offices were needed when the East India Company was up and running. In fact, the need was inextricably linked with colonialism. The factories set up by the trading companies were basically forts with their own military for defences and manual labours for processing and storing traded goods. But that's a lot of moving parts to keep track of, especially with vast wealth coming through the company. There were shareholders to pay, members to promote, and trading routes to be maintained. At their core, these factories were administrative hubs. In this palace, clerks were as valuable to the project as soldiers or warehouse workers. If anything, the clerks were more valuable because their skill set was unique. They were harder to replace than the other employees. As the company grew, the administration departments needed to keep up, which meant reworking parts of the job and work environment. New buildings were constructed to have private rooms where clerks could study, and larger spaces where meetings could be held. This structure was invigorated during the Industrial Revolution. Mechanical workers were still encouraged to work in groups under supervision, though the danger of their work required this practicality, even if the fat cat factory owners resented their own employees. As for the clerks, they had their own rooms, far from the noise and dangers of the factory floors. This front office, back office structure maps beautifully onto the aristocracy, where the servants stay downstairs and the people of the house remain upstairs. Never the twain shall meet. This shifted economic power from the office workers and away from the employees making the goods, fueling economic development. After all, one accountancy firm can work for multiple factories. This meant the skills of a clerk were much more transferable than those of a factory worker whose abilities started and ended with the technology they operated. The moment a new machine comes in is the moment their employment is threatened. However, a clerk is more nimble and cannot be automated out of existence. As Charles Darwin discovered, the rule of nature is survival of the fittest, which is why the office job was able to take root so firmly when it was finally conceptualized. However, office jobs still weren't running the show. They were still seen as a specialism saved for elites. It would take something to make office jobs aspirational for the average person. In 1868, typewriters were patented. It reduced the demand for clerks with pens. According to a test by famed architect P.G. Hubert Jr., one typewriter saved 40 minutes off the hour. Typewriters were such a success that manufacturer Remington went from selling 1,400 a year to 14,000 in 5 years. This revolutionized administrative work more than the impact of telegraphs and telephones. These inventions became the standard of every successful office because they extended the sphere of influence office workers had over society. If you don't believe me, look at your keyboard. Most people on the planet still use a QWERTY layout, which was originally developed to prevent the keys of typewriters from getting jammed. Technically, it's more efficient and faster to use a Dvorak layout, or even the machines court stenographers use, where they type not the next letter, but the next sound. So, if you want to eliminate office work, start by learning a different keyboard layout. As typewriters made it easier to get work done, this created more work to get done. Typists were needed to replace the clerks of old, which became a stable way for women to enter the workforce. Now, an office job was stable and aspirational. It was achievable. A woman had other options besides being a homemaker, and these options were compounded when the two world wars broke out. In fact, the victories of these wars were undoubtedly influenced by the efficiency of office work. Back in 1911, the mechanical engineer Frederick Winslow Taylor created a system for management that used a science to figure out the ideal office structure. Nowadays, in a world of assembly lines for cars and cheeseburgers, there's an efficient way to delegate work. Still, this was a radical idea at the start of the 20th century. Taylor argued that the task of management was to determine the best way for a job to be done, provide adequate tools and training, and create incentives for good performance. This marks a significant step in how office jobs utilize psychology to increase productivity. His brand of management was called Taylorism, and involved reducing an office task to the most essential mechanical process. He worked diligently with a notepad and stopwatch to calculate every action's cost in both time and money. Even after the end of World War II, when offices had become the norm, his legacy on American culture is still apparent. Thanks to him, offices were able to implement standardized ways to keep costs down and improve productivity. The concept of an office had received an upgrade because now there was a scientific insight into what office work is. His concept helped make distinctions between the expectations of managers, which helped codify what constitutes a promotion. However, one thing Taylor couldn't grasp was the nuance of mental health in relation to job satisfaction. He naively believed that completing a job quickly and well made employees happy. In other words, employees were happy when their bosses were happy. But anyone who's survived the monotony of an assembly line can attest that it drains your enthusiasm for work and life. Things changed around the mid-century because the relationship between happiness and job satisfaction had been researched. This led to deeper thinking about how the office landscape could improve standards. In Europe, a new idea emerged: Bürolandschaft. It concerned how human relationships could improve working, and the end conclusion was the proto-open office. In the 40s and 50s, offices had been structured around closed doors and bullpen offices. However, this arrangement could not accommodate the growth of post-war countries. There needed to be a smarter way to use the current real estate. In 1958, the brothers Eberhard and Wolfgang Schnell created a consulting group to come up with a new idea. They removed the uniform rows of desks and integrated managers into the space by tearing down their office walls. Office plants and temporary screens demarcated areas. Though not completely the type of layout you'd see in a modern, trendy tech company, its diversion from Taylorism was still groundbreaking. By removing the barriers between workers and supervisors, everything was more egalitarian. Workers shared spaces regardless of their level in the hierarchy. The days of the manager having his glass box elevated above the factory floor were over. Europe warmed to the idea, but America picked it up in the 1960s when a researcher from Herman Miller adapted this bold new idea. This man was called Robert Probst, and he detested the layouts of 1960s offices. He found them restrictive and oppressive. He wanted to, quote, free the worker, but found the Bürolandschaft approach had lofty aspirations. American cities have different real estate, city infrastructure, and societal attitudes. A European model will only partially translate to an American office. You know what I mean if your American office has a European team who becomes unreachable as soon as they take their 5 weeks of paid vacation. And for those viewers working for a European company in America, you know how strange it is to be expected to respond to an email on the weekend. So Probst mixed the best from both to create the Action Office. The Europeans may have come up with the prototype of the Open Office, but Probst took it out of beta testing. It was the perfect middle ground between the flashy Bürolandschaft model and the private-focused traditional way of doing things. Workers would move from desk to complete tasks. A desk for a typewriter, or a desk for a meeting or telephone call. It was pitched as an individual office amid a larger open space. That way, employees were free-range enough to foster an egalitarian environment, so that the ideas and solutions could be transmitted without interference from the hierarchy. Yet, there were special spaces so that workers in deep focus could attend to the work at hand. If you like the sound of that, then you're just like the experts who first saw the Action Office. On paper, it was the perfect solution, but actual managers hated it. The idea didn't sell at all. Maybe it was because some managers weren't kids of the 60s, so they hated change. Or perhaps it was because not every countercultural idea works in practice. However, Probst wasn't deterred. If anything, he was inspired. He went back to the drawing board to create the Action Office 2. Don't worry if you've never heard of this, because you more than likely have worked in one, or at the very least, seen one. This idea was so successful that even copycats made vast sums of money. They may have missed some of the details, but it went to show how Probst had found the sweet spot. This sweet spot started off as the savior of the office worker, but quickly became the office clerk's oppressor when it debuted in 1964. The cubicle. That's right. 3 grey walls were the happy medium between the aristocracy of the factory floor and the free-range hippiedom of mid-century Europe. In Probst's defense, it wasn't he who invented it, it was the market. He had tried to strong-arm managers into adopting a more radical idea with Action Office 1, but in business, the customer is king. If he didn't sell cubicles, someone else would. Before his death, Probst called the cubicle a hellhole, and judging from the iconography of office life in the later part of the 20th century, everyone agreed. By 1998, 40 million employees in America had worked in 42 versions of the Action Office. Not that anyone called it that, except maybe a few managers and hired consultants. To everyone else, it was simply the office. Its design had been optimized so well that its structure was ubiquitous with working. So much so that citizens started creating home offices. The Industrial Revolution may have had studies and libraries, but a home office is something completely different. Libraries and studies imply a pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, somewhere to better yourself. But a home office is, well, just that. A place in your home where your office now exists. It's where you work, even when you're not at work. During the 80s and 90s, designs for new homes started to implement home offices into their layouts. The last time a standardized home design had such a revamp was when living rooms were planned to have a place for your TV instead of your fireplace. That and moving the outhouse indoors. Nowadays, estate agents will advertise the office room in their postings with almost as much significance as a bedroom. For the young working content creator, a home office or studio could be more important than where you sleep, assuming you even make a distinction between where you work and where you sleep. With the home office, the concept of an office job had reached its apex. But then, something came along that was as revolutionary as the typewriter: the internet. With the turn of the millennium, the dot-com companies were rethinking the office because of the overhyped belief that the internet would automate the computer in the same way the computer automated the typewriter, and the typewriter automated the feather-penned clerk. And with stellar valuations being thrown left, right, and centre, dot-com companies saw the power of interior design. The grey, sterile cubicles were replaced with expensive, bespoke furniture, original artwork, and flashy water fountains. Now, the office is seen as an extension of a brand. Now, an office job could be cool, and a cool office job improves your social status. Even now, tech companies hire interior designers to create lobbies and entrances to attract the right talent and discourage the wrong applicants. Boomer and Gen X managers are less keen on trendy furniture. In contrast, millennials and Zoomers think an office's appearance is as important as how it functions, and they might even argue it's related. Though the dot-com bubble took out a lot of these design-conscious companies, their impact lasted longer than Pets.com's sock puppet mascot. The Action Office is dead. Long live the Open Plan. Facebook's offices are the biggest open plan office in the world, as it houses 2,800 staff, plus an array of splendid art and furniture. Zuckerberg swears by the power of open plan, despite new research suggesting they aren't nearly as productive as we think. Noise pollution, distraction, poor temperature regulation, and lack of privacy suggest it's only a matter of time until the open office is scaled back. But revamping it might be impossible, because one thing that's propping up offices is the social status of having one. This means a new layer of defense for the office is what David Graeber affectionately calls bullshit jobs. In short, it's a new type of job where people pretend to work. If you've seen those TikToks showing a day in the life of a techie where all they seem to do is eat ice cream, then you know exactly what a bullshit job is. Jobs like the flunkies exist to make something feel important. Think of the 12th junior executive who gets a secretary for his secretary to give the illusion that he's so busy. There are the duct tapers who exist to fix the gaps from managerial overreach, and the box tickers who create the illusions of productivity, like compliance officers and PR specialists. Despite what the employees might think, these jobs are performative. They are decorative. They exist for no other reason than to make the office seem more important than it is. There's a simple test you can do to see if you have a bullshit job. If you can't describe your job in 3 words, then it's bullshit. There's another way to know if you have a bullshit job. Were you fired during the COVID pandemic? Okay, that's harsh, but the point is how working from home showed companies which employees could afford to stay. Companies had to tighten their purse strings, so the first to go were workers who weren't working. Tech, finance, and insurance sectors led the work-from-home boom because of how computer-intensive their high-paying jobs are. Before March 2020, only 7.2% of workers were work from home. But once the lockdown hit, it rose to as much as 61.5%. Now it's down to 27%. So the dream of work from home making the office obsolete is well and truly over. People hoped that greater flexibility would improve productivity, giving employees better work-life balance and less stress. Plus, less time stuck in traffic during the commute, not to mention replacing long meetings with quick Zoom calls, at least in theory. But as time went on, the horror of work from home came to light. One of the main problems was the lack of stability. You have a better chance of being laid off if you work from home than if you go to the office. But this isn't down to proximity bias or managers on a power trip. The simple truth is, humans are social creatures. We need interaction. If you never come to the office, your peer-to-peer learning will suffer. Your office integration will be weaker, which means communication breakdowns are inevitable. Currently, companies are experimenting with hybrid offices that allow a mix of work from home and work from office. So what's the future of office jobs? With new technology, automation is always inevitable, though it would be foolish to imagine AI replacing everything. Your job is more at risk from outsourcing to the Philippines than being taken over by ChatGPT. One thing that is certain is how the status of office jobs is waning. Wearing formal clothing like suits is rare, meaning people are more comfortable going to the office in casual clothes. In addition, there is a rising trend of Zoomers and Alphas being more interested in content creation than being a faceless cog in a corporate machine. It suggests a laid-back view of an office, far removed from the aspirational allure of decades past. It's being reflected in office layouts too. Larger companies are integrating different spaces, from courtyards to private booths to large meeting rooms. But before you get a sense of déjà vu, consider how some futurists expect offices to blend into nature more. Future cities may be more walkable and less car-centric, which could be reflected in a more seamless office environment. Do we need to tear down another boundary between home and work? Or is this talk pie in the sky because the best way to get work done is to get a bunch of people to sit at a desk in a room and work? If you liked this video, check out our one on how we went from living in caves to living in assets. And be sure to subscribe to keep learning how history works.